You might imagine the center of an empire as a place of quiet grandeur, marble columns, or perhaps the faint sound of ruling in the background. In Tenochtitlan, the Aztec capital, the reality was quite different and substantially damper. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is. It is always interesting to see who is joining us from around the world. Now then, let us ease into tonight's journey together. Step back to the early 16th century in the Valley of Mexico, where the Mexica people, whom most now call the Aztecs, ruled one of the largest cities the world had ever seen. Their capital, Tenochtitlan, floated on Lake Texcoco like a rather determined experiment in urban planning. Built on a series of artificial islands, linked by causeways and bridges, the city was home to perhaps 200,000 people, although, as usual, the census takers seem to have lost count after the first 100,000 or so. Water was everywhere, sometimes in the canals, sometimes in the streets, and occasionally in places where nobody wanted it to be. For a society that mastered floating gardens, the number of accidental puddles was a tribute to ambition outpacing waterproofing. One might be surprised to discover that the city's main market could attract as many as 50,000 people on a good day, all jostling for maize, chilies, and the occasional live turkey. The Aztecs took their shopping rather seriously. So seriously, in fact, that there were official market judges on hand, ready to resolve disputes over the quality of beans or the authenticity of a feathered cloak. These judges wore special cloaks of their own, because apparently nothing settles a commercial disagreement like very conspicuous fashion. Picture yourself there, standing at the edge of the great Tlatelolco market, shoes slipping slightly on flagstones, still wet from the morning mist. Vendors call out prices in a cacophony of nahuatl, and the air is thick with the scent of roasting maize, crushed flowers, and a faint trace of the lake's less desirable aromas. To your left, a group of porters unloads baskets of cacao beans, the preferred currency for most, provided nobody tries to cheat by filling their sack with counterfeit beans. On the right, a priest passes by on his way to the main temple, face adorned in ceremonial paint, and looking as though he has neither slept nor forgiven anyone for it. Of course, the Aztec capital was not all trade and ritual. The population spent much of its time attending to daily routines, fetching water, grinding maize, weaving clothing, and on special occasions, attending elaborate ceremonies atop the city's grand pyramids. The city's rulers, from Moctezuma down to the lowest market official, busied themselves with tribute collection, diplomatic intrigue, and the occasional public announcement that the gods had once again requested everyone's participation. There was, it seems, always another festival to attend, another rain god to appease, and another set of instructions to follow. As one resident might note, comfort was found mostly in communal bathhouses, and the hope that the next harvest would outdo the last. It is worth noting that for all its size and splendor, the Aztec capital was not especially quiet. Canoes slid through the canals at all hours, musicians tuned their clay flutes with more enthusiasm than accuracy, and the city's bureaucrats made certain their voices carried from one causeway to another. In Tenochtitlan, the business of staying organized was matched only by the city's talent for appearing as if it had run out of dry places to stand. With that image in mind, all damp flagstones, crowded causeways, and officials settling disputes in their finest cloaks, it is time to wade slightly deeper into the world of the Aztec capital. In the early years of the 16th century, the Valley of Mexico was dominated by water, stone, and a people who seemed determined to live where others saw only swampland. In the center of Lake Texcoco stood Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Mexica people, more commonly known as the Aztecs. The city rose from a network of artificial islands, held fast by stakes and willow roots, and knitted together by a lattice of canals and causeways. Every morning the mist hung low over the lake, shrouding the city so that the first rays of the sun revealed rooftops, temple steps, and the occasional unlucky fisherman who had slipped and ended up wetter than planned. The city itself was a marvel of urban planning, at least when viewed from a distance, or perhaps from a canoe, which was the preferred method for arriving at most destinations. The main causeways, broad and paved with stones, connected Tenochtitlan to the lake's edge, allowing goods, tribute, and the occasional ambitious trader to filter into the city from all directions. The canals, which doubled as streets for thousands of small boats, were lively with activity from sunrise to sundown. That these waterways also served as the primary method of waste disposal was a reminder that urban convenience has always come with its own set of complications. Everywhere the pulse of daily life echoed through the sound of paddles striking water, the grinding of maize on stone metates, and the shuffle of sandals on damp flagstones. Commoners wore simple cotton tunics and skirts, their clothing dyed in earthy tones that after a few months of hard use all faded to a similar shade of brown. Nobles distinguished themselves with finer weaves, colourful cloaks, and jewellery of jade or gold, although the city's humidity did little for anyone's appearance. The smells that drifted through the streets mingled roasted maize, smouldering copal incense, and depending on the wind, fish drawn fresh from the lake or something less appetizing seeping from the canals. Tenochtitlan was a city built upon agriculture, as much as ambition. The chinempas, or floating gardens, stretched along the lake's shallow edges, each a careful patchwork of mud, reeds, and crops. Farmers, their feet caked in lake mud, coaxed maize, beans, and squash from these plots with a dedication that rivaled any priest. The success of these gardens fed not only the city, but also its network of markets, where produce, textiles, and trussed-up turkeys made the rounds. For those with influence, a steady supply of cacao beans and tribute goods was guaranteed. For those without, the best one could hope for was fresh maize and the patience of the market judges. Religion shaped the daily rhythm of Tenochtitlan as much as hunger or commerce. The city's skyline was dominated by the Templo Mayor, a double pyramid rising above the central plaza, where priests performed rituals in view of anyone with a neck long enough to crane upward. Every major festival saw the city transformed, with processions, drumming, and the burning of incense so thick that even the mosquitoes seemed to lose their way. The gods required regular attention, and the city's rulers ensured that ceremonies were frequent and memorable, if not always entirely comprehensible to those required to attend. Moctezuma II, the city's emperor at the dawn of the 16th century, presided over it all with a mixture of ceremony and calculation. His palace, occupying its own block near the temple precinct, was said to contain 100 rooms, each more comfortable than the last. Though comfort was a concept reserved for royalty, the emperor and his court were attended by a swarm of scribes, stewards, and officials. The number of attendants necessary to keep pace with Aztec bureaucracy was evidently large enough to justify a small industry in reed mats and feather fans. Laws were issued in clear terms and enforced with a diligence that made even minor infractions memorable. Commerce thrived, shaped by geography as much as custom. The causeways that connected Tenochtitlan to the mainland were lined with traders carrying everything from obsidian blades and woven baskets to tropical bird feathers and shells drawn from distant coasts. Canoes laden with produce arrived early, their pilots hoping to secure a prime spot in the sprawling market. News traveled almost as quickly as goods, although accuracy lagged somewhat, and rumors had a habit of outpacing fact. Architecture in Tenochtitlan was a careful interplay of stone, stucco, and paint. The city's public buildings and temples were constructed from volcanic rock, faced with lime plaster and decorated in red, blue, and white. Most homes belonging to commoners were built from adobe bricks and roofed with thatch, proof that even in a city of grand temples, practicality had its place. Drainage was, at best, a work in progress. Heavy rains were met with stoicism, and repairs were considered complete when fewer than 3 leaks remained. For all its splendor, Tenochtitlan was a city shaped by necessity, ingenuity, and the understanding that stability was only ever as reliable as the next harvest or the mood of the gods. Its people rose with the sun, tended their gardens, navigated muddy causeways, and prayed for just enough rain, neither too much nor too little. The city may have floated on a lake, but its routines were as grounded as any in history. Tenochtitlan's routines unfolded on a scale that still resists comparison. The city's population moved through its days with a rhythm set by season, by festival, and by the unceasing demands of tribute. Subjects from tributary towns brought maize, beans, cotton, and feathers, moving through the city's causeways with burdens balanced on their backs and expressions suggesting they had long since ceased to be impressed by pyramids. Tribute was an institution as much as an economic strategy, shaping the relationship between Tenochtitlan and the wider valley. Those who provided generously might expect a measure of imperial favor. Those who did not found the Aztec tax collectors to be surprisingly persistent and perhaps more thorough than one would have liked. The city's commoners, known as Mashualtin, formed the backbone of this imperial operation. They lived in neighborhoods, organized around their clan, or kalpuli, each with its own small temple, communal garden plots, and occasionally a school where children learned the arts of farming, craftwork, and the correct way to greet local officials. Homes were clustered together, their walls of adobe and stone, providing a measure of privacy in a city where news, and sometimes cooking smoke, traveled quickly from one door to the next. Mornings were marked by the sound of grinding maize, the first task in a long day's work to produce tortillas and tamales. If the city's rulers made grand announcements from their palaces, most citizens were busy with more pressing announcements, like the arrival of fresh water from an aqueduct, or the discovery that the neighbor's turkey had once again escaped its pen. Religion seeped into every aspect of daily life, but not always with the drama suggested by later accounts. Small shrines stood at street corners, adorned with flowers and offerings of food. Most households performed their own rituals, asking for good harvests, or successful weaving, or sometimes the simple hope that it would not rain during market day. Public ceremonies, though, were difficult to ignore. The great festivals devoted to Tlahuac, Huitzilopochtli, and other deities brought thousands into the central precinct, where priests conducted rituals with all the precision expected in a society convinced the gods were only ever one neglected duty away from annoyance. The scent of burning copal mingled with that of roasting food, and those not directly involved in ceremony could at least be certain of the day's entertainment. Trade was the artery of the city, pulsing through its great markets. The largest at Tlatelolco drew sellers and buyers from across the region. The market was crowded, noisy, and astonishingly well organized, overseen by officials whose job was to ensure that disputes over the quality of gourds or the weight of fish did not spiral into a full-scale commotion. Vendors offered everything from obsidian knives and salt to embroidered cloaks and live birds. Cacao beans functioned as currency, though their tendency to spoil quietly ensured that most traders developed a sharp eye and a careful touch. It was understood that market day was not just for buying and selling, but also for gathering news, meeting friends, and establishing who had recently acquired a new feathered headdress. Social standing in the market shifted with the weather, the latest arrivals, and occasionally the judges' opinions on the day's disputes. Agriculture remained the city's quiet triumph. Chinampas ringed the settlement, their edges marked by willow trees and the busy movement of farmers tending crops. Canals allowed produce to be delivered efficiently, though the system was as dependent on human muscle as on any engineering feat. If the gardens produced well, the markets overflowed. If not, explanations involving displeased gods and neglected rituals soon followed. The connection between the fields and the temples was never entirely theoretical. Architectural ambitions continued to reshape Tenochtitlan. Stoneworkers and laborers built and rebuilt the city's temples and public buildings with a regularity that suggested the gods had a particular interest in renovations. The Templo Mayor, with its twin shrines, received attention whenever a ruler wished to mark a new reign or a military victory. Repairs on causeways or canals were ongoing, their completion usually celebrated by the cheerful announcement that future repairs would be needed soon. Houses of the nobility boasted painted walls and courtyards, while communal bathhouses, temescal, offered relief from both the city's dirt and its bureaucracy. The bathhouses were heated by stones, filled with steam, and run with the efficiency expected in a society that treated cleanliness as both a virtue and a necessity. Rulers like Moctezuma II maintained order through a combination of spectacle, strict law, and a bureaucracy able to track tribute down to the last basket of beans. Public announcements were delivered by criers, who made their way through the city with the authority of men who knew too many people were listening. Laws were enforced by judges who enjoyed the advantage of being more visible than the average defendant. Punishments ranged from the symbolic to the rather decisive, an arrangement that ensured most disputes were handled before they reached the steps of the palace. Through it all, Tenochtitlan held together by routine, obligation, and no small amount of patience. The city's people attended to their gardens, their households, and the business of living under the gaze of their rulers and their gods. It was a world where daily life continued according to rhythms set by harvest and ceremony, by the quiet order of neighborhoods, and by the understanding that stability came from shared effort and a cautious respect for both tradition and authority. Beyond the routines of daily life and the steady management of tribute, Tenochtitlan was a city that lived under the careful gaze of its own institutions, where order was maintained as much by habit as by decree. The Kalpali, or neighborhood councils, organized everything from the maintenance of canals to the arrangement of local festivals. Each district took responsibility for its own affairs, from policing minor disputes to ensuring that the communal gardens did not fall into neglect. The result was a form of governance that, at least in principle, kept the city's sprawling complexity from sliding into chaos. Larger problems, however, quickly found their way to the palace, where imperial officials proved that bureaucracy, even in the 16th century, was both endless and rarely without a queue. Political life at the top was marked by ceremony and a level of caution bordering on paranoia. Moctezuma II received tribute, visitors, and reports in his palace, surrounded by guards and officials whose main qualification appeared to be an ability to stand very still. Audiences with the emperor were staged affairs, with strict rules governing how one approached, how one spoke, and most importantly, how quickly one retreated. The emperor himself lived at a remove from ordinary citizens, receiving news filtered through layers of bureaucracy. It was said that Moctezuma kept multiple informants on hand, just to ensure the city's gossip reached him before it reached the market. Communication, in other words, was something of a competitive sport. The city's priests wielded considerable authority, presiding over rituals and maintaining the elaborate calendar of ceremonies. The Templo Mayor was their stronghold, and within its precincts, the cycle of festivals unfolded with impressive regularity. Every month brought a new celebration, some lasting for days, others featuring processions, music, or the offering of food and flowers. Not every citizen attended every event, but the presence of drumming and the scent of incense ensured that nobody could ignore them entirely. Priests were easily distinguished by their long hair, special cloaks, and an expression of practiced seriousness. Their influence extended beyond religion, as they advised rulers and interpreted omens with the assurance of men whose job descriptions left little room for doubt. Markets, meanwhile, continued their steady business, linking Tenochtitlan with distant regions. Merchants known as Poctica traveled far beyond the valley, returning with luxury goods and much-needed news. Their journeys brought obsidian from the mountains, cotton from the lowlands, and even tropical fruits from the coast. The market, Tlatelolco, absorbed these goods with the efficiency of an institution that had seen nearly every trade scam attempted at least once. The market was also a space for social mobility, as successful merchants could rise in status, though never quite enough to threaten the nobility. Prices fluctuated according to supply, the weather, and the collective mood of the judges, who bore the unenviable task of deciding which feathers were decorative and which were simply wishful thinking. The city's architecture reflected both ambition and adaptation. The ceremonial precinct was dominated by multi-tiered pyramids, their steps worn smooth by years of use and renovation. These structures were faced with brightly painted stucco, their edges maintained with a regularity that suggested either pride or a persistent belief that the gods inspected paintwork. Residential areas, by contrast, offered less spectacle. Common homes clustered along the canals, their floors swept clean with bundles of reeds, and their interiors decorated with painted gourds, clay vessels, and the occasional prized pet bird. Domestic tools were fashioned from stone, bone, or wood, and the act of preparing food was a daily ritual involving a great deal of grinding, chopping, and, if fortunate, very little supervision. Agricultural work continued at the margins of the city, with farmers using canals and raised fields to coax crops from the damp soil. Children assisted their parents in tending the chimas, occasionally distracted by waterfowl or a frog worth chasing through the reeds. Festivals marked planting and harvest, with offerings left at field shrines to encourage the right combination of rain and sunlight. Meals for most consisted of tortillas, beans, chilies, and, when circumstances permitted, a modest piece of fish or turkey. Food was described as hearty, though that mostly meant identifiable. Social life extended into the evenings, when families gathered in their courtyards and neighbors exchanged stories. Communal sweat baths provided respite from the demands of the day, and meetings in the warmth of steam-filled rooms allowed for the polite exchange of news and the occasional complaint about taxes. Clothing, regardless of original color, tended to fade into the same earth-toned palette by midsummer, lending public spaces a certain understated uniformity. News traveled quickly, though accuracy lagged behind, and by the time an imperial announcement reached the outer districts, its subject had often been replaced by something more interesting. Through these routines, the people of Tenochtitlan managed to keep the machinery of their city running, forging connections between neighborhood and palace, market and field, priest and farmer. It was a world constructed from habit, obligation, and the careful management of both resources and expectations, in which even the most glittering ceremonies were anchored by the unremarkable but essential patterns of everyday life. As the seasons passed in Tenochtitlan, the interplay of civic routine and ceremonial obligation proved persistent. Each neighborhood remained responsible for its share of public works, which included the long, patient task of keeping streets and canals clear of refuse. This was not merely a matter of civic pride, but a practical concern, as the city's network of dikes and aqueducts required constant attention to prevent flooding and the arrival of water in places where it was least wanted. Local laborers patched causeways, cleared silt from waterways, and periodically reinforced the chinampas with fresh mud and reeds. Any lapse in maintenance became obvious after the first heavy downpour, as the city's drainage system, impressive as it was on paper, had a habit of demonstrating its limitations with each rainy season. At the heart of Tenochtitlan, the ceremonial precinct thrived as the focal point of religious and political life. The Templo Mayor loomed over the plaza, its twin staircases leading to sanctuaries dedicated to the gods, Huitzilopochtli and Tlaloc. Priests and attendants carried out rituals in regular procession, their cloaks stained with pigment, on certain occasions with less pleasant substances. Offerings were made frequently, ranging from flowers and food to more symbolic gestures of piety. On festival days, the sound of conch shells and drums echoed through the city, marking time as much as the passing of the sun. The scent of burning copal drifted across rooftops, mingling with the more earthy odors rising from the canals below. Political authority was still concentrated in the palace. When Moctezuma II continued to oversee the machinery of power. His word was delivered through a cadre of officials, each charged with maintaining order and extracting tribute from the city's districts. The emperor himself was rarely seen in public, except during major ceremonies, preferring to rule from a series of interconnected rooms lined with mats, painted screens, and the ever-present guards. The rituals of court life were elaborate to the point of inconvenience. Courtiers spent hours waiting for an audience, only to deliver reports that the emperor, predictably, had received from at least 2 other sources. Decisions were rendered with a show of deliberation, while in reality, much depended on precedent and the steady accumulation of paperwork. The city's markets remained boisterous, regardless of season. Tlatelolco, the central market, bustled with activity from early morning. Vendors arranged their wares with care, mindful of the ever-watchful judges who ensured weights and measures were not tampered with. Goods arrived by canal, carried in baskets, or piled onto reed rafts. Buyers haggled over fish, chilies, and woven mats, while porters moved through the crowds with the single-minded focus of men determined not to lose their place in the queue. The market's sounds blended calls, laughter, and the occasional sharp remark from a judge settling a dispute with the weary authority of someone who had heard the same argument countless times. Social interaction was both structured and informal. The Kalpuli councils managed local concerns, from water disputes to the organization of feasts. Marriages were arranged with the involvement of elders who preferred stability to excitement when matching families. Children attended the Telpok Koli or Kalmikak, schools designed to instill discipline, teach the basics of religion and mathematics, and ensure that every child could recite the day's litany of responsibilities. Evenings saw families gather in courtyards, sharing simple meals and reviewing the day's events, sometimes in the presence of neighbors who had dropped in unannounced. As was their right, agriculture advanced through careful attention and communal effort. Chinampa plots were divided among families, each expected to maintain their share or risk the gentle admonition of the local council. Produce from these floating gardens supplied much of the city's food, and any surplus was traded in the markets. The demands of tribute meant that families sometimes found themselves balancing personal needs with imperial quotas, a process that inspired an appreciation for both efficient farming and plausible explanations during official inspections. The seasonal cycles shaped the rhythms of work and rest, with planting and harvest marked by small rituals and quiet celebrations. Architecture remained pragmatic, with common homes constructed from adobe, topped with reed thatch, and decorated with painted designs. Wealthier households featured stone walls and painted murals, along with gardens planted with ornamental flowers. Public spaces were swept daily, though the city's climate and the constant movement of people made lasting cleanliness elusive. The Temescal, or sweat bath, continued as a fixture of neighborhood life, visited for health, relaxation, and the exchange of news. Here, the practical matter of being clean served as a convenient excuse for discussing more sensitive matters away from the ears of the city's officials. Throughout these routines, the people of Tenochtitlan cultivated a sense of order and continuity, reinforcing the idea that stability was both a collective achievement and a daily negotiation. The city's systems were grand in concept and often adequate in practice. Still, as with any human endeavor, they survived as much by adaptation as by design, shaped by the persistent demands of water, work, and the ever-watchful eyes of both gods and rulers. Periods of relative calm in Tenochtitlan brought their own routines and expectations. As the city's infrastructure creaked under the weight of its population, small adjustments became the order of the day. Water carriers moved steadily along the causeways, balancing ceramic vessels with the care of experience. Their footsteps passed over stone pavements, worn smooth by generations, while the sound of them echoed beneath the arcades of the market. The city's many bridges were raised and lowered with a frequency that suggested someone was always in a hurry, although the pace of traffic rarely kept up with the ambition of those directing it. The city's neighborhoods continued their careful dance of obligation and autonomy. Each Kalpuli maintained its own identity, with markers in the form of painted banners hung at street corners. These banners, faded by sun and rain, signaled local pride as effectively as any official edict. Commoners attended regular meetings where concerns were voiced, such as the reliability of the water supply or the ever-present issue of boundaries between garden plots. If a dispute remained stubborn, it would eventually find its way to the local judge, whose rulings were considered final, although hardly unanimous in their popularity. The expectation was that social harmony could be reached by consensus, or failing that, by sheer repetition. Religious festivals punctuated the weeks, carried out with an efficiency that made them seem routine, though their underlying significance was never in question. The calendar was crowded with ceremonies large and small, requiring not only the participation of priests, but also the logistical support of households, local councils, and anyone with a talent for carrying flowers or constructing temporary altars. On festival mornings, the city filled with the sound of shells and drums, sending a message across the rooftops that the gods were once again to be honored. Offerings ranged from baskets of maize and woven garlands to more elaborate displays, depending on the wealth or ambition of the sponsors. Children learned early that festivals required both patience and a willingness to stand still for long periods, though the promise of special foods usually kept complaints to a minimum. Political life continued under the watchful direction of Moctezuma II and his council of advisors. Communication flowed in multiple directions, though always ending at the imperial palace, where decisions were drafted, reviewed, and announced with predictable formality. The emperor received word not only from the core districts of Tenochtitlan, but also from distant outposts of the empire, carried by messengers whose endurance was matched only by the limited patience of those who waited for results. Important matters, such as tribute totals, agricultural yields, and the movements of merchants, were compiled by scribes and read aloud in long sessions that left no detail unmentioned. The art of governance, in this context, consisted mostly of preventing any one topic from becoming so urgent that it disrupted the established routines. Daily life persisted in the margins of these official proceedings. Bakers prepared maize dough before dawn, while potters shaped clay into vessels destined for both ritual and practical use. Children fetched water, swept the courtyards, and occasionally managed to lose themselves among the crowds of the morning market. Cooks tended fires in open hearths, their movements practiced and unhurried. The preparation of tamales or the roasting of chilies filled the air with aromas that drifted through the city's narrow lanes, mingling with the less pleasant reminders that Tenochtitlan's systems of waste removal, for all their sophistication, were not infallible. Trade remained as essential as ever, its rhythms governed more by habit than by regulation. The great market at Tlatelolco was a place where everyone from the humblest laborer to the most prosperous merchant could witness the empire's reach in the form of unfamiliar goods. Here, cacao beans changed hands, textiles were judged for their tightness of weave, and ambitious traders attempted to impress buyers with claims as elaborate as the featherwork on display. Prices were set by negotiation, with the occasional intervention of an official required when haggling exceeded what might be considered civilized. Yet, even disputes seemed part of the ordinary business of the market, resolved with a mixture of resignation and the understanding that everyone would be back tomorrow, ready to try again. Architecture developed at a steady pace, marked by continual repairs and the occasional expansion of neighborhood temples or communal spaces. Stonemasons and builders patched foundations, repaired mural edges, and added decorative touches where time and resources allowed. The city's skyline remained defined by the Great Pyramids and the profile of the palace, but the reality beneath that skyline was shaped by the quieter work of maintenance. Those who repaired roofs regarded their work as finished once. Rain entered only through the most persistent leaks. Tenochtitlan, thrived not on spectacle alone, but on the discipline of its people, their willingness to uphold traditions, and the shared effort that allowed a city built atop water to remain standing year after year. In this way, order was preserved, not through grand gestures, but through the daily, steady application of attention to detail, patience, and the constant negotiation between ancient custom and the demands of an ever-growing metropolis. The approach of each new season was marked in Tenochtitlan by subtle shifts in the city's routines. As the rains returned, so did the great procession of umbrellas fashioned from palm leaves and the renewed vigilance against leaks in every household. Damp stone corridors and reed mats left to dry in the fleeting sun became familiar sights. Within each kalpuli, residents prepared for the demands of both weather and ritual, cleaning canals, reinforcing causeways, and bringing offerings to the small shrines that stood at street corners. The city seemed to breathe with the seasons, absorbing change without losing its underlying structure. Religious practice intensified around the turn of the seasons. Priests at the Templo Mayor and lesser temples coordinated a calendar so crowded that it was possible to stumble upon a ceremony most days. The offering of food, flowers, and intricate paper figures continued, with more elaborate observances reserved for dates of special importance. The air was thick with incense, punctuated by the sound of drums and the sharp calls of conch shell horns. On major feast days, the streets filled with processions. The crowds followed priests draped in embroidered cloaks, their faces obscured by ritual paint. Children watched from doorways, adults murmured the names of deities, and the rhythm of the city shifted to accommodate the requirements of devotion. For most, these festivals were as much an obligation as an opportunity for temporary indulgence. The imperial palace remained the center of political life, its courtyards always bustling with officials, messengers, and those seeking favor. Moctezuma II held court with a studied sense of decorum, surrounded by advisors and dignitaries from distant provinces. Audiences were conducted with order, if not always with brevity. Decisions were issued according to precedent, with the occasional interruption from a particularly persistent petitioner determined to be heard. The emperor's instructions filtered through multiple layers of bureaucracy before reaching the neighborhood councils, a process that ensured no edict ever arrived in haste. There was a general assumption that if something truly urgent required imperial intervention, it had probably already resolved itself. Economic activity reflected the city's seasonal rhythms as well. The market at Tlatelolco was busiest in the aftermath of harvest, as new supplies of maize, beans, and fruit entered the stalls. Merchants arrived in canoes laden with fresh produce and rare goods, their journeys sometimes slowed by storms or the unexpected collapse of a particularly spirited chinampa. Market judges stood at their posts, ready to examine scales and mediate the inevitable disagreements over weights, measures, or the ever-contentious subject of counterfeit cacao beans. The air was dense with the mingled aromas of roasting grain, burning incense, and bodies pressed together in the narrow aisles. Buyers moved from stall to stall, inspecting wares and engaging in prolonged negotiations, which, depending on the participants, could last the better part of a morning. Agriculture continued to shape the pace of life. Fields on the edge of the city, built up over generations with patient labor, yielded crops through a combination of skill and stoic optimism. The chinampas, carefully maintained, provided not only food but also a sense of order. Farmers and their families worked together, rowing out before dawn to tend vegetables, repair fences, and collect waterfowl eggs. The work was repetitive but essential. When the rains were favorable and the harvests abundant, meals grew more generous and spirits lifted, though celebrations rarely distracted anyone from preparing for the next cycle. The memory of lean years lingered, and caution remained a feature of agricultural life. Domestic architecture evolved according to necessity. Homes were adapted to the demands of the season, with thatched roofs, patched, and mud walls reinforced to keep the worst of the weather at bay. Courtyards collected rainwater, sometimes intentionally, and everyone learned to avoid the slipperiest stones after a downpour. Those with means invested in painted decorations or small gardens, while common households prioritized repairs and the secure storage of food supplies. Bathhouses, or temazcal, offered relief from the chill, and the warmth of steam was a daily comfort during the wet months. Throughout these cycles, the people of Tenochtitlan navigated the coexistence of order and unpredictability. Social relationships were maintained through shared labor, mutual assistance, and a tacit agreement that the city's complexity could be managed by diligence rather than brilliance. Authority emanated from the palace and the temple precinct, but its effect depended on the cooperation of thousands of hands. The city's endurance rested on this collective effort, shaped by a pragmatic understanding that, in Tenochtitlan, survival was never the achievement of a single ruler, priest, or noble, but the result of innumerable small decisions made each day in the face of water, weather, and the expectations of both gods and neighbors. As another year progressed in Tenochtitlan, the city continued with a determined regularity that must have been both reassuring and at times quietly exhausting for its inhabitants. Political life became increasingly absorbed with the challenges of managing an ever-expanding sphere of influence. Moctezuma II, conscious of his responsibilities as both emperor and chief priest, remained ensconced within the palace walls, surrounded by courtiers whose loyalty was measured partly in ceremony and partly in their ability to avoid unnecessary accidents of protocol. The emperor's presence in public was reserved for major rituals and processions, in which he appeared with a dignity that discouraged interruptions and ensured that messages would be relayed through several layers of officialdom before any response was required. In the city's neighborhoods, daily life was marked by an unhurried but persistent activity. Repairs to homes and public spaces were coordinated through the Kaupoli Council, whose members displayed the patient confidence of people who had seen the same problems return each rainy season. Stone masons and thatchers worked with a measured pace, prioritizing essential repairs over any grand improvements. If a roof kept out most of the rain, it was considered a success. In kitchens, families ground maize for the day's meals, while older children fetched water and younger ones trailed after their parents to the market, absorbing lessons in bargaining and observation that would serve them for years to come. Markets provided not only necessities, but also a measure of distraction. The Tlatelolco market maintained its status as the empire's commercial heart. Trade goods arrived from hundreds of miles away, their presence a silent testimony to the reach of Aztec tribute and exchange. There were baskets of dried fish, piles of chilies in varying degrees of potency, and textiles of many colors, though those colors had a tendency to fade into the same familiar palette before too long. The market's judges intervened in disputes, their judgments accepted with a mixture of resignation and relief. News and rumor circulated efficiently, though accuracy, as ever, seemed an optional extra. Religious observance filled the city's calendar, with cycles of festivals dedicated to deities who demanded attention as regularly as the city's canals demanded clearing. Priests presided over rituals with a gravity born of tradition, their presence marked by elaborate costumes, painted faces, and the unmistakable odor of copal incense. On festival days, entire neighborhoods might assemble to witness offerings and processions, the air heavy with music and the scent of roasted maize. Temples stood open to supplicants, though the inner sanctuaries remained the preserve of priests and dignitaries. The expectation was clear. Public displays of piety were a civic duty, but the more intricate mysteries of faith remained the concern of specialists. Economic demands continued to thread through daily life. Tribute remained a subject of constant negotiation, as imperial officials circulated with detailed lists and a keen interest in full compliance. Farmers tallied their produce, artisans delivered their quotas, and the city's more enterprising residents found subtle ways to pass inspections. Surpluses were celebrated with understated satisfaction, but everyone understood that each successful delivery simply set the standard for the next assessment. It was a system that rewarded persistence, if not always, innovation. Agriculture, on the Chainampas, progressed season by season, shaped by steady effort and communal coordination. The floating gardens yielded maize, beans, squash, and flowers, along with the occasional frog or duck that had strayed from neighboring plots. Maintenance of the Chainampas required cooperation as well as patience. Family groups repaired embankments, weeded rows, and shared tools, all under the tacit supervision of elders who remembered harder years. The cycle of planting and harvest was punctuated by small rituals, and family gatherings became opportunities to reaffirm both kinship and collective resolve. The built environment of Tenochtitlan reflected these rhythms. Public spaces, swept daily but never quite immaculate, displayed painted murals and stone sculptures depicting gods, animals, and rulers. Houses clustered along the canals, their entrances marked with simple woven mats and the occasional painted gourd. Gardens featured medicinal herbs and decorative flowers, while domestic animals wandered through courtyards with the air of creatures used to human unpredictability. Bathhouses continued to offer respite, providing warmth and a measure of privacy for conversation. Furniture in most homes was sturdy enough to last generations, and uncomfortable enough to discourage any unnecessary idleness. Throughout all these routines, the city maintained its sense of order and direction. The palace projected authority, the markets sustained trade, and the temples provided purpose. Yet, it was in the quiet, repetitive acts of everyday life that the true endurance of Tenochtitlan became apparent. Year by year, season by season, the people adapted, adjusted, and with persistent practicality, kept their city afloat in the literal and figurative sense. In a society so carefully constructed, stability rested not on grand gestures, but on the countless ordinary efforts of those who each morning simply attended to the business of living. Through the steady pulse of life in Tenochtitlan, the city's relationship with its surroundings shaped both its fortunes and its anxieties. While the floating gardens allowed the population to feed itself, the wider empire's tribute system ensured a continual influx of resources from a broad and often restive network of subject towns. Each delivery of textiles, maize, cacao, or precious feathers served as a reminder of Tenochtitlan's reach, as well as its dependence on the willingness or resignation of others. The roads and causeways leading out from the city, carefully maintained and patrolled, became not only avenues of travel and commerce, but also symbols of imperial expectation. Imperial officials, charged with monitoring tribute and enforcing decrees, maintained a visible presence in the city and its periphery. These functionaries moved with a seriousness befitting their tasks, bearing lists that were as long as the patience of those who found themselves audited. The process was regular yet rarely smooth. Local councils negotiated the terms of delivery, citing weather, pestilence, or the unpredictable nature of river traffic as explanations for shortfalls. The palace responded with reminders, and, on occasion, more direct interventions. The system, never entirely equitable, functioned largely through inertia and the persistent attention of those with a vested interest in keeping the city supplied. Social mobility remained limited, but not entirely impossible. Merchants who succeeded in foreign trade could rise in status, sometimes acquiring privileges in their own kalpuli or being invited to attend the more prestigious festivals. The Poktikay, or long-distance traders, enjoyed certain exemptions and held their own courts and schools. These privileges, while notable, never allowed the merchant class to eclipse the nobility, whose status was carefully preserved by both law and custom. Children of nobles attended the Kalmek, where they learned ritual recitation, arithmetic, and the protocols of public life. Commoners' children, by contrast, were trained in the practical arts, military skills, and the expected forms of respect towards authority. The distinction was clear, and for most, unchanging. Religious observance continued its steady course, woven into the routines of every household. The Templo Mayor and the surrounding precinct remained busy with processions and sacrifices, the scale of which varied according to the religious calendar. Festivals for the rain god Tlacoa, the sun god Huitzilopochtli, filled the city's streets with color and sound. The practical result was several days of altered schedules, closed markets, and a city awash with food, music, and depending on the festival, a visible increase in flower petals or spent copal incense. Participation was expected, and for many, a matter of social standing as much as faith. Those who failed to present themselves at major ceremonies could expect attention, if not from the priests, then from their neighbors. Architecture adapted to the demands of the present and the expectations of the future. Expansion of the ceremonial precinct was ongoing, with laborers and masons raising new altars, repairing steps, and renewing painted facades. In the city's residential districts, families invested in the cyclical repair of walls, the replacement of reed thatch, and occasional attempts at water management that often fell short of perfection. Public buildings were maintained with varying degrees of enthusiasm, usually depending on the likelihood of inspection by higher authorities. The overall impression was of a city that valued both grandeur and utility, but was content to leave true comfort to the realm of memory or anticipation. Trade within the city remained lively. Boats arrived daily, paddled across the lake by men and women, whose familiarity with the currents was matched by their acceptance of damp clothing. Market stalls showcased the products of distant lands, salt from the coasts, obsidian blades from mountain quarries, and woven baskets, whose origin could be traced by those with an interest in such matters. The daily exchange of goods supported not only the city's economy, but also its social structure, providing opportunities for negotiation, demonstration of generosity, and the subtle assertion of status. Within homes and neighborhoods, the steady patterns of work and rest prevailed. Food preparation followed the routines set by the seasons, as families adjusted meals according to what was available and what could be preserved. Communal baths and evening gatherings remained the best opportunities for sharing news and grievances, while the city's younger residents found spaces to play or practice the skills demanded by their elders. Night fell early, bringing a hush that settled over the canals and market squares, broken only by distant music or the voice of a late crier carrying the day's news through the damp air. Amidst these cycles, the city's population endured, adapting expectations to circumstance and drawing reassurance from the reliability of the familiar. In Tenochtitlan, the business of empire was experienced most often in the form of routine, measured, repeated, and for the most part, unremarkable, except in its ability to persist, despite the ambitions and uncertainties surrounding it. By the later years of Moctezuma II's reign, Tenochtitlan's intricate machinery of order pressed on. Even as the scale of its administration quietly expanded, the city's networks of canals, causeways, markets, and offices strained under the increasing weight of imperial ambition. Palace scribes recorded tribute deliveries and population counts with the care of people who suspected someone would check their work, if not immediately, then certainly in the next audit. Runners, official messengers of the empire, darted along the causeways at all hours, carrying instructions outward and returning with reports, grievances, and occasionally the unwelcome news of resistance in tributary towns. News moved faster than most people, with accuracy still trailing some distance behind. In the city's Calpulli, daily life remained occupied with meeting obligations. Neighborhood elders oversaw the allocation of communal tasks, ensuring that canal clearing, market cleaning, and the endless patching of roads continued with as little friction as possible. Those who failed to participate could expect a brief but memorable conversation with the local judge, whose authority rested on a well-established ability to recall every previous infraction. For those who followed the routines, the rhythm of work and rest stayed much the same. The sounds of grinding maize and paddling canoes punctuated the mornings, while the afternoons brought a mixture of commerce and muted conversation as people met in shaded courtyards or along the edges of the market. Religious observances maintained their regular course. The city calendar, crowded with ceremonies large and small, demanded participation from nearly every household at some point. Priests in paint and feathered cloaks performed rituals atop stepped pyramids, watched by crowds who observed the proceedings with both reverence and a touch of calculation. Attendance at major ceremonies was both a duty and a social performance. For most, the outward displays of devotion were as important as the inner meaning, and the boundaries between faith and formality remained politely ambiguous. Trade continued to animate the heart of the capital. The Tlatelolco market reached further than ever, drawing merchants from allied and subject communities. Canoes arrived with textiles, dried fish, obsidian tools, fruit, and the increasingly coveted cacao beans. The market's layout followed long-standing patterns, but each arrival brought the possibility of novelty. Judges moved through the crowds, resolving disputes and ensuring the weights were honest, or at least consistent in their dishonesty. Above the noise, the clatter of barter and the call of vendors, children learned their first lessons in negotiation and the value of patience. Agricultural work progressed at its measured pace. Chinampa plots, carefully parceled out along the shallows, provided a steady yield. Families tended beans, squash, maize, and amaranth, rowing out before dawn to weed and repair the floating beds. When harvest was good, some of the surplus reached the markets. Most was reserved for the household, or set aside to meet the ever-present expectations of imperial tribute. The wisdom of older farmers, usually expressed with remarkable brevity, guided the maintenance of these gardens and preserved knowledge of what to do when the rains failed to appear on time. The architecture of Tenochtitlan, both sacred and domestic, continued to evolve within established boundaries. Construction projects in the ceremonial precinct reflected the ambitions of the empire, with workers hauling stone, mixing lime, and repainting temple facades. A fresh coat of red or blue signaled the city's pride in its public spaces, even as the private homes clustered around the canals rarely achieved such polish. Most households invested time in patching walls, repairing reed roofs, and keeping the worst of the water outside. Decorative objects, such as painted gourds and clay figurines, appeared in even the smallest homes, evidence that aesthetic pleasure was not the exclusive domain of the nobility. Throughout it all, the subtle interplay of cooperation and tension shaped the city's social life. In times of abundance, feasts and festivals spilled into the streets, with music extending long after work was done. In leaner years, food was shared quietly, and complaints were voiced in low tones, usually beyond the hearing of local officials. Information traveled swiftly, but so did reminders of the proper forms of behavior, delivered by neighbors who took communal order as both a duty and a pastime. In these years, Tenochtitlan did not advertise its uncertainties, but the effort needed to sustain the city's balance became more visible. From the palace to the furthest garden, each individual played a part in a system whose scale invited both admiration and fatigue. If the city's achievements seemed inevitable, it was only because so many people took care to repeat the necessary tasks, season after season, under the unblinking gaze of both rulers and gods. While the wider imperial administration in Tenochtitlan pressed onward, the daily rhythms within the city maintained a steady momentum. Officials' records expanded, but within the households, continuity was prized above novelty. Each morning still began with the grinding of maize on stone metates, a sound as persistent as the calls of waterfowl nesting among the chinempas. Elderly women swept the paved lanes outside their homes, their movements unhurried, as neighbors exchanged nods or the occasional understated complaint about market prices or the latest tribute assessment. The priorities of rulers rarely changed what was expected from the ordinary citizen, but everyone understood that falling behind on obligations soon led to visits from officials whose patience was as thin as their official cloaks were elaborate. The city's religious calendar wove its cycles through these routines. There were few days in any year unmarked by at least a minor observance. Offerings of tamales, flowers, or paper banners appeared at household shrines, while larger occasions called for neighborhood processions or gatherings at the Templo Mayor. Priests, instantly recognizable by their carefully tangled hair and cloaks of stiffened cotton, coordinated the ever-rotating schedule of rituals. On festival mornings, the streets took on a ceremonial orderliness. Even children who otherwise darted through the market with unrestrained enthusiasm learned the protocol of standing quietly as a procession passed. The scent of burning copal hung in the air, blending with the less fragrant reminders that the markets were close and the canals never entirely clean. Political events unfolded at a different pace, largely behind the walls of the palace compound. Moctezuma II met with his council in chambers decorated with painted screens, featherwork, and the occasional jaguar skin. Matters of urgent state received painstaking attention, though the more routine complaints of market judges or local stewards often waited until the afternoon or were quietly delegated. The emperor's rare public appearances continued to elicit respectful silence, though most citizens had learned to interpret imperial mood from the speed with which messengers crossed the causeways or the increased presence of patrols along the market's edge. Speculation about imperial intentions thrived wherever residents gathered for more than a few moments. Trade remained essential, and at times, a welcome distraction. Canoes glided through the canals, heavy with salt, chilies, fruit, and other goods from distant towns. Paddlers called their prices in the bustling aisles of Tlatelolco, voices rising above the low hum of barter and idle negotiation. Market officials, armed with wooden tally markers and an air of authority, intervened only when disputes threatened to disrupt the perpetual flow. Most arguments were over weights, the reliability of scales, or the freshness of fish, though the sharper-eyed traders also watched for the occasional creative attempt at counterfeiting cacao beans. The market was not just a place to buy and sell, but also a space for news, gossip, and the subtle measurement of one's standing in the community. Agricultural schedules held steady. The Chinan Pass yielded their produce with as much reliability as any human effort could guarantee. Shared work groups maintained the dikes, weeded the beds, and watched for pests. Children gathered wild greens along the canal banks or caught frogs in the shallows, while elders supervised the distribution of the day's harvest. When time allowed, families gathered beside their plots for simple meals, the taste of fresh maize or amaranth punctuated by quiet conversation, and the occasional reminder to avoid the softer sections of the causeway. Architecture continued its slow evolution. Repairs to homes, shrines, and communal spaces occupied those with surplus time or a particular concern for appearances. Paint was renewed in the temple precinct, and sections of stone paving were replaced after heavy rains made clear which parts of the city's infrastructure had not weathered the season. Reed mats and clay vessels lined the interiors of most homes, and the walls bore painted patterns in red, ochre, and blue. Bathhouses, their stone chambers filled with thick steam, welcomed people in the late afternoon. Here, the business of the day was discussed out of earshot of officials, with the added benefit of emerging somewhat cleaner. Amid all this, the ordinary concerns of health, kinship, and reputation occupied center stage. Midwives tended births in close-packed homes, with the composure of those accustomed to improvisation. Healers dispensed remedies of herbs, clay, and steady warnings against particular foods. Social bonds were maintained through feasts, shared labor, and a continual exchange of favors, promises, and advice. Stability in Tenochtitlan was achieved not through sudden inventions or drastic reforms, but by the careful sustaining of patterns and responsibilities that, if unremarkable, proved more resilient than any single policy or monument. The city's endurance was built from countless acts of adaptation, each day mirroring the last, with just enough variation to keep order intact.